Hi, I'm John Keenan, State Senator from the Norfolk and Plymouth Senate District, representing the City of Quincy and the towns of Abington, Braintree, Holbrook, and Rockland. I want to thank you for joining me today. This is bringing Beacon Hill to you, which is the video version of what we've been doing by newsletter. It's our first attempt to bring this information to you by video, so please be patient as we work our way through it. We're going to start with a series of 3 informational programs focusing primarily on the state budget. The first one will deal with the budget process. The second one will deal with historical revenue and spending trends. And then we'll go into the fiscal year 2015 budget in our third episode. We've put together this information, and as I present the information, there'll be some slides that will pop up on the screen, and so you'll be able to follow along. We'll try to keep it as interesting as possible. The budget process really is not as complex as a lot of people may think it to be, and that's part of the purpose of this program, is to kind of take the mystery out of what we do here at Beacon, up in the State House on Beacon Hill, and to bring you the information that you need. So the budget process really begins at the first day of a fiscal year. So for instance, the budget that went into place for the fiscal year 2014, which we're in right now, the preparation for that started a full year earlier. So this past July, as we passed the fiscal year 2014 budget, we immediately began work on the fiscal year 2015 budget, which will take effect upcoming July 1st. So how does the process work? Well, basically, the governor's staff, his secretaries who head the various departments in the governor's office, they go about gathering information as to what to include in the next year's budget. They meet with people who work in the department. They meet with advocates. They meet with people who have some expertise in a particular subject matter that may be outside of government. And they do all that with the idea of crafting a departmental budget. That's done. The Secretariat will review all that information and meet with the governor, and the governor's staff, his Secretary of Administration and Finance, will then begin the work of putting together the budget. A lot of the work takes place in August, September, and October of the preceding year, so to speak. So the governor does all of that. He takes the information and ultimately puts it in bill form and submits it to the legislature. While that is going on, there's also a process to determine what type of revenue will be available to support that spending program, the spending program of the governor. So the governor, his Secretary of Administration and Finance, the House Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Committee on Ways and Means hold hearings to determine what revenue will be available. And they come up with a consensus revenue figure. And they typically do that in December. So the governor's staff puts the budget together. As they're working on the budget, there are entities, agencies, and experts working on trying to figure out what amount of money will be available. So the governor refers to economists, both inside and outside of government. He deals with advocacy groups. He deals with academics who may have a sense of what the economy is doing and what type of revenue will be available. All that information comes together. The recommendation is made. The Ways and Means Committee take that recommendation, and they ultimately arrive at a consensus revenue figure. That's the amount of money generated at the state level that will be available to fund the governor's proposed budget and ultimately to fund any budget that's approved by the House and Senate. So the governor's budget is ultimately submitted to the legislature in January. This year it was submitted January 22nd of 2014. The governor files it. It gets assigned a number, and it's then referred to the House Committee on Ways and Means. Now, the House Committee on Ways and Means is not bound in any way by the governor's budget proposal. They take it, they review it, they look at the budget for purposes of determining what the priorities may be of the governor, and then they set about crafting their own budget. They go through a process much like the governor's office did. They meet with advocates. They meet with members of the governor's staff. They meet with people who believe that there should be certain programs in the budget or that certain programs may not be funded in the budget. They come up with their own budget. And they also, during the course of this process, hold hearings. They go throughout the Commonwealth and hold hearings in different regions. And typically those hearings are joint hearings, meaning they are staffed, or they're attended rather, by members of the legislature, both from the House and the Senate. So the Joint Committee on Ways and Means hold these regional meetings in order to get testimony on the budget. 8 meetings were held between February 4th of 2014 and March 7th of 2014. And again, they go to different regions because different regions may have different concerns about what may be included in the state budget. So the public and the secretaries submit testimony, which they will use, which the House and the Senate Committee on Ways and Means will use in the preparation of their budget. So the House and Ways and Means, as I say, reviews the governor's budget. They determine what the priorities are of the governor, and then they make an assessment as to whether those priorities are the priorities of the House of Representatives as well. The budget is presented to the House out of the Ways and Means Committee, and then members of the House have the opportunity to file amendments to that budget. Those amendments are then put before the body, the House of Representatives, on the House floor and are debated. That debate can go on for 2-3 days. Historically, it's gone on longer sometimes, and historically it's gone on for a shorter period of time as well. So that's what happens from the time the governor puts together his budget, introduces it, and the House puts together their budget. The House budget ultimately comes out sometime in April and is, as I say, put before the board, and that's put before the legislature, the House of Representatives, and that's when the debate process begins. Now, when they're doing that, the Senate also has had the opportunity to review the governor's budget, to review it in the context of the governor's priorities, the same priorities as the Senate. The Senate chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, while the House is preparing their budget, will meet with members of the state Senate, one-on-one with staff as well, to try to determine what the individual priorities are of the individual senators. Senators are allowed to talk about the issue, to present them, to try to get the Ways and Means Committee to believe as well that they are priorities. And the Ways and Means Committee tries to take all those priorities as presented by each of the senators and come up with a comprehensive budget document. They do that. They finalize their version of the Senate budget. It's then presented to the Senate, and much like in the House of Representatives, it goes to the floor for debate. Now, last year there were 725 amendments that were filed by senators on a whole range of matters. Some of them were related to the budget, some of them were not. Generally, the Senate tries to not include in the budget policy matters, particularly if policy matters are subject of separate legislation. So, for instance, in the last budget debate, while it was occurring, the state Senate was working on a comprehensive EBT reform package. And yet, during the debate on the budget, several amendments were offered to reform EBT. So those amendments were voted down with the idea that there was a separate bill that was being prepared, a separate policy that was being discussed, and that would be the subject of separate legislation that would come before the body. And in fact, a couple of weeks after the Senate budget was done, the Senate did receive that comprehensive EBT reform package and did pass it. So oftentimes during the debate on the budget, you will see amendments introduced that aren't directly related to the budget, but nonetheless trigger debate. But if there is separate legislation making its way through the process, those amendments typically are voted down, and then ultimately the legislature, in this case the Senate, will vote on the comprehensive policy that has been crafted and gone through the full legislative process. So once the Senate budget is debated, amendments are determined, and those amendments can be voted on a roll call vote. If they're less controversial, they will be voted on with a voice vote, meaning all those in favor say aye, opposed say no. But either way, certain amendments are adopted, certain amendments are not adopted. The process can take quite a while. It can take anywhere from 2 to 3 days, very long days. The discussion sometimes is in depth, sometimes it's cursory, again, depending upon the merits of the amendment that's being presented. But ultimately, a budget is voted on as amended, and that becomes the Senate version of the budget. So at this stage in the process, you have the governor having submitted a budget, which was reviewed by both the House and the Senate. House went to work and prepared its own budget, introduced amendments to it, discussed, debated those amendments, came up with a final House budget. After that, the Senate introduces its budget. Amendments are offered. There's debate. The Senate comes up with its version of the budget, a Senate budget. Now we have a House budget, a Senate budget. The governor's budget is somewhat put aside, and the House and Senate have to come to terms on a budget document that would be presented to the governor. So there is what they call a conference committee. A conference committee is appointed by the Senate president she appoints the Senate members of the conference committee. Typically, it's the chairman of the Ways and Means, maybe the vice chairman of the Ways and Means, and there's Republican representation on that conference committee as well. And the Speaker of the House does the same thing on the House of Representatives side. So they are then charged with meeting and working out any differences that exist between the House budget and the Senate budget. Those differences can be extensive in some areas. They can be minor in other areas. The process usually is that the minor issues are taken care of rather quickly. If they're technical matters, they are taken care of very quickly. And then the bigger issues are left for negotiation between the members of the conference committee. The conference committee process can take anywhere from a week to several weeks, and typically it goes towards the end of several weeks. Ultimately, a conference report is released, and that is presented to both the House of Representatives and the State Senate. Once the conference report is released to each side, to the House and to the Senate, there is an up and down vote on that, meaning it's not subject to any further amendments at that point. You accept the proposal as it came out of conference committee, and you vote yes or no, and you typically vote in a roll call vote as to accepting that conference report. That conference report then becomes basically the budget being offered by the legislature to the governor. The budget, in that form, goes to the governor, and the governor has, at that point, several options. The governor has 10 days to act. The governor can veto the budget in its entirety. The governor may veto or reduce line items or different sections in the budget. The governor at that point cannot add anything to the budget. And if the governor does not act within 10 days, then the budget presented to him by the legislature becomes law. Now, oftentimes the governor will veto certain line items or different sections, and he will send those vetoes back to the House or the Senate. The House or Senate then votes whether to override those vetoes. They cannot change anything, they cannot add, they cannot subtract. Basically, the veto comes back from the governor, and the House and Senate have to vote whether to override that veto. At that point, it takes a 2/3 majority of the House and a 2/3 majority of the Senate in order to override the governor's veto. So then you have the budget. With the overrides, it goes back to the governor. If the overrides are still in place, if the legislature has been successful in voting those overrides, it goes back to the governor in that form. And the governor typically, at that point, signs the budget. And it becomes known as the General Appropriations Act, the GAA spending bill, oftentimes known as Chapter whatever of the Acts, for instance, of 2014. That budget then takes effect on July 1st. For instance, in this case of 2014, it will take effect for fiscal year 2015. And right after it takes effect, the governor's staff, the legislature, the Ways and Means Committee within the legislature get to work in preparing for the next year's budget. So it is a lengthy process, but a pretty straightforward process. Some would argue that it produces a budget that does very well for the Commonwealth, and some people would argue that it doesn't do well. The interesting thing is during the process, there are advocates who are weighing in at each and every step. And by advocates, it may be lobbyists who represent particular clients who have an interest in the budget. It may be people from the cities and towns, for instance, mayors, members of the Board of Selectmen or city councils who are advocating for additional local aid. You may have the superintendent of schools or school committees looking for more education funding. You may have parents of children with developmental disabilities looking for additional funding for their programs. There's a whole range of people who weigh in during the budget process. And typically their information, the information that they offer, the guidance, the advocacy that they do is valued by the legislature because it gives us a bigger picture, a broader view of what the line items mean. You know, in addition to all the formal process that takes place relative to the budget, meaning the governor doing his thing, the House and the Senate doing their things, legislators are out and about on a daily basis learning about what's in the budget. We may go to a school, for instance, that receives state funding for children with developmental disabilities. And it's very helpful for us because we get to see what a line item in a budget, what a dollar figure in the budget actually means to the students in that school. And it goes across the whole range of issues. We may go out to, for instance, in Boston, the Hinton Laboratory, and take a look at that laboratory to find out what the state funding does for the laboratory. Now, for instance, I went out to the Hinton Laboratory and visited it and learned that the facility, while well maintained, is getting old, is getting dated. And the work that goes on in that laboratory is critical, work that we never see, work that's done by epidemiologists to make sure that we're not subject to some of the disease or not exposed to some of the diseases that wreak havoc across the world. So it's very quiet work that goes on. But by going out and seeing that, we're able to put behind the line item, behind a dollar figure, a face, and in this case, the face of employees doing great work. And it goes all across the different types of entities. Recently, I went out to the Framingham State Prison to look at their facilities, to determine how they're handling what they call Section 35 civil commitments. Again, a great opportunity to see how the Section 35 civil commitment process is working, whether our funding is adequate, whether our funding is being used wisely, whether programs are being offered, and whether the facility is in the shape that it should be to provide those programs and to meet the needs of the people who are sent there. So we do that constantly throughout the course of the calendar year, the fiscal year, however you may want to define it. It's part of our education process. It's how we learn about the intricacies of the budget, and particularly to make sure that the taxpayers' money is being spent as wisely as possible and as carefully as possible. So again, that's the budget process. Hope to take a little bit of the mystery out of it. You read what goes on in Washington and what goes on here at the State House, and sometimes it seems rather confusing, but again, it's a pretty straightforward process. One note where we are somewhat different from the federal government, we managed to pass budgets at this level. We managed to work, both Republicans and Democrats, together to get a budget passed. We don't always agree on items, but ultimately a budget is passed. And we are required here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to balance our budget, and we do every year. So it is a mandated measure of fiscal restraint that we must meet, and it works very well for the taxpayers of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So that's a quick view on how the budget process works. If you have any questions at all about that process, please do not hesitate to contact me. You can reach me at the State House. The information will come up on the screen. You can write to me, State Senator John Keenan, State House, room 413B, Boston, Mass. 02133. You can email me at john.keenan@masenate.gov. You can get additional information at the website www.senatorjohnkeenan.com, and you can also join us on Facebook. The other way you can get in touch with us, and I think it's the most effective way, is to pick up the phone and give us a call. Somebody will answer the call and make sure that any information you're seeking or any concerns that you have are addressed. The number is 617-722-1494. So please do not hesitate to call us. And then finally, if you're in the State House, please feel free to drop by. Literally and figuratively, my office door is always open. People come in all the time. They have concerns. They'll come in the office. We'll sit down and talk. And I'm more than willing to go out to the district, and I do it on a regular basis through office hours in each of the towns, or by appointment. I'll meet somebody at a library or a coffee shop, whatever the case may be, to discuss individual concerns of that person. So please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. We're here. I am here to represent you and serve you, and I very much value your input. The next show that we will do will be a show that will touch on the budget as well. It will look at the history of revenues in the Commonwealth, where we get our money, and we'll also take a look at how we spend our money here in the Commonwealth through the budget process. And then we will have a third show that will look more specifically at the fiscal 2015 budget. Again, the budget that is making its way through the legislative process as we speak. So thank you for joining me. I look forward to being before you with our next episode. And again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to call. I'm John Keenan, State Senator. It's an honor to serve you. Thank you.